So today we'll be looking at the key takeaways from the first quarter of this year for the art market, which has been quite an interesting time in the art
Definitely.
world, quite a lot of change.
I totally agree with you. I think it's been a really fascinating quarter and I'm really looking forward to unpacking it with you.
Let's take a look at Sotheby's. I know we spoke a little bit about Sotheby's
Yes.
last time.
Yes. It's some
They-
controversial statements.
yeah, I think they're a wonderful brand, but they've definitely been going through, and it's well publicized, a period of change. And there's
Definitely.
quite a lot going on with Sotheby's.
Yes.
This quarter, what was particularly interesting was Sotheby's very first ever auction in Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
By all accounts, it was a resounding success.
Yes, I
think
agree.
it totaled, I think the sales totaled about 17 million. I've been really interested to see there's been a sort of uptick in art happening in the Middle East, good international art happenings in the Middle East. And so this was quite symbolic of that. That sale went really well. It was interesting. There was a healthy mix of international and regional artists. There was Banksy that sold for over a million and Magritte that sold for over a million.
Yes.
Additionally, of the Western artists, there was a very heated contest for the James Turrell
Yes.
light installation.
Yes. He's so popular. Yeah.
He's so popular. And that eventually sold for $660,000,
Wow.
I believe.
Yeah.
There was also a record set for the Syrian artist, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, Louis Kayani.
Mm-hmm.
That was set at $900,000. And then a very influential Saudi Arabian artist, Mohammed Al Salim, his work tripled its resale estimate. It was a really robust sale and a great turnout by all accounts for their very first Saudi sale. And I was in the Middle East around that time. Just afterwards, I was in Dubai and Abu Dhabi visiting friends. And whilst in Abu Dhabi, I got over to the Louvre.
I saw it looked so beautiful.
Yeah. I'll pop a photo of the video up here if anybody would like to take a look of the exhibition. Kings and Queens of Africa, Forms and Figures of Power. And that was absolutely exceptional, not least the majesty of the building itself. I think the Louvre Abu
It
Dhabi,
looks so stunning. Yeah.
it's possibly the most beautiful music I've seen.
Amazing.
And then the exhibition was brilliant. It was just a really seamless blend of historic contemporary artists with historic artifacts and antiquities, and
Beautiful.
it was done so well. So
Yeah.
it's just, I think it's so exciting to see what is beginning to happen in that region.
Absolutely. Yes. And you got to see Zacco Bay sculpture as well,
I did see Zacco
Yeah.
Bay's sculpture,
which
exactly.
is, had recently sort of been placed at the museum. So I was very excited that you got to see it in person because he's an artist who I've worked with before and whose work I really admire. So that's amazing that you got to have such a wonderful experience. And I totally agree with you. There are a lot of happenings in the Middle East. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how that market continues to evolve and to see how, perhaps major galleries might start to open within the region. I think that's something that a lot of people are discussing as a potential possibility.
Exactly. The museum's got on there first.
Exactly.
The auction houses and the galleries are bound.
Follow.
Follow,
Exactly. One
exactly.
of the other things that we wanted to discuss as one of the sort of major events from the first quarter of this year were obviously the really tragic LA fires that kind of swept huge parts of LA and mainly the Palisades area. I think from what I read, the fires lasted 24 days and they ended up eating into 23,000 acres of land, which is a crazy amount when you think about it. And given that there are so many local artists that are based in LA, it really had a profound effect on that local community. And a lot of artists lost their homes. They also lost their studios and subsequently works that they were working on to produce for upcoming exhibitions that they had lined up. So the big question was, given that the fires happened in January and Frieze was due to happen in February alongside the other satellite fairs such as Postal Art Fair and Felix Art Fair, was do the fairs go ahead? And I think that was a huge, huge question that people were asking themselves. And on the one hand, it felt slightly tasteless or a bit tone deaf to perhaps march ahead with a huge commercial endeavor. But on the other hand, it was a way to provide not only hope to a lot of local artists, but also to provide them with income ultimately after they had suffered such huge and devastating losses. So the fair took a lot of initiatives in order to help kind of try to give back to local artists. And one of the things which was set up was the LA Arts Community Fire Relief Fund. And so a lot of the dealers that partook in the fair actually dedicated a good amount, perhaps around 10% of their earnings to this fire relief fund in order to help kind of give back to the local community. Another initiative that the fair took was they set up the Frieze Arts Alliance, which involved about 20 museums across the country, including the Guggenheim and the ICA Miami. And the idea behind that was to encourage museums to use their budget to buy art from the fair itself in order to help boost sales. Dealers also took other initiatives, such as I know Peritan rejigged his booth, about half of his booth, in order to showcase the work of local LA artists, such as Emma Gardner and Ebba Webster. So it was actually, from what everyone had said, it was actually a very profound moment because it was a moment of coming together.
Exactly.
And it was a moment of real solidarity and people really trying to see how art could actually not only provide inspiration and hope, but it could also provide a way out of a very sort of dark time. So I think it was a very hopeful fair. And I think from what I understood, there were fewer international collectors because I think when you're reading the news of, such an outburst of sort of a fire tearing through a city, it would be more intimidating to people who are further away to come and fly in. But for more domestic buyers, so either local sort of collectors or collectors throughout the US, they actually did show up and they really, really showed their support by, buying and interacting with what there was on offer that week. So I think it was a real success overall.
I think it was a success, and the sales were really so were strong.
Absolutely.
Well. I think, collectors were very conscious of supporting the people of Los Angeles, the artists of Los Angeles.
Absolutely.
And there were also quite a lot of notable sales by women artists. Possibly the largest sale was Elizabeth Payton at David Spanier Gallery.
Yeah.
That was nearly 3 million. And then there was Alice Neal.
Yes.
Nearly $2 million at Lisa Yuksavich as well. And her work sold for, I believe, 1.6 million.
Wonderful.
So some really exciting female artists did wonderfully at the fair.
Yes. Another thing which was actually really touching was for artists who had, perhaps lost, because this happened to quite a few artists. Artists had actually produced works in anticipation of being shown at Frieze, and due to the fires had actually lost entire bodies of work.
Yeah. Yes.
In the fires. And so I was reading about Alec Egan, who's an artist who's represented with Anat Ebke, who's a local LA dealer who actually has 3 spaces in LA. And it was incredible just to see how people took the initiative to overcome their difficulties. And so Anat ended up creating a makeshift studio in her gallery for Alec. And he was actually, had lost his home, lost his studio, has 2 children. It sounded like a completely traumatic event, but actually took the event and used that as his motivation, his inspiration for the new body of work. And actually the fires appeared across several of his works that he later had to reproduce in anticipation of the fair. And I just think it's just a very kind of inspiring story, and it shows a lot of resilience and also a lot of innovation on behalf of his dealer to try and kind of turn things around. She also released a series of prints that had been made in tandem with an exhibition of his from a few years before. And she released them for sale online. And I think they were $100 a print, and there was 100 in the edition, and all of them sold out within a very short space of time. So that also was, sort of enabled him to have some sort of income as he was working on these new works and as he was trying to sort of rebuild his life after losing everything. So I just thought that was a really inspiring story and very touching to see what people can do in very difficult times.
I love seeing this innovation and new ways of working and tackling challenging situations.
Absolutely.
And on that note, there have been quite a few new collaborations that have been announced. And I don't know if you want to talk a little more about those.
Yes, absolutely. It's really interesting. I think in our last video we did, which was the overview of 2024, but also giving some of our projections to 2025, we touched on this idea of kind of new models proliferating. And one of the things which I suppose I failed to mention, but that is, it seems to be the case more and more, is this idea of galleries actually joining forces. So we've spoken at length about how the operational costs for galleries have become incredibly challenging. And I think up until now, there's really been a grow or go mindset in the market, which is that if you are unable to keep up, unfortunately were forced out of business. And recently it's been really, really amazing to see, as you said, this more collaborative spirit and a more innovative one where they're sort of challenging the status quo and saying, okay, things have been done up until now in this way, but it doesn't mean that it has to go on in that way if it's not sustainable. And so there's been news of a couple of New York galleries who have actually joined forces. So JDJ Gallery have just invited Dina Evans Projects and Chiswick Family Art Gallery to join them in their Tribeca space. And the idea is that each gallery will show 4 different exhibitions within the space throughout the year, and they will split the operational costs. So it's a much more sustainable way of running the business for them. And one of the things that, was mentioned, whilst they were kind of sharing this new business model with the press is talking about how actually, not having a show on all year round would then free them up to spend more time with their artists and more time with their clients, which is actually the part of business that they love the most and which really ultimately benefits their galleries the most by maintaining strong relationships with their client base and also with their artists. So it's really interesting to see this happen. There was another example of Proxico and Instituto de Visión moving into the same Lower East Side space. And they're actually going to be showing exhibitions concurrently, which is incredibly interesting. I'm really fascinated to see how that plays out. And I think it's really, it's a breath of fresh air. It's really, really interesting to see people, instead of kind of butting heads and working against each other, actually joining forces and seeing if that can make them stronger and better and more resilient, especially in a market which has proven to be quite challenging.
This is fascinating. And I suppose it's, they're all quite early stage of collaboration. So I'll be really interested to see how this works out in the long term. Navigating personalities and different ways of working.
Definitely.
And how the figures look as well.
Yes.
If it's successful.
Which is obviously a crucial,
or not. So it'll be really interesting. So, and then with it being March, well, we've got the auctions here in London. We've got the London auction.
Yes.
And we have TFF Maastricht happening.
Yes.
So let's start with the auction.
Sure.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had, I think, overall sort of good, slightly cautious sales that took place at Christie's and Sotheby's and Phillips, of course, but I'll focus mainly on the two big houses. So Christie's went ahead and did a sort of back-to-back sale of 20th and 21st century and also surrealist evening sales, sort of all mashed into one, which sold for a total of £130 million. The surrealist sale was undoubtedly a huge success with only one work unsold. So when it came to sort of the main highlights, both houses were quite cautious when it came to including ultra contemporary works, which is sort of the works of sort of young emerging artists, which at some point was really kind of dominating the market.
Yeah.
But now, and especially in between 2023 and 2024, that whole market actually dropped by 40% on the auction market. So people are very cautious about that. The market has contracted. So people are really going for well curated and low risk sales at the moment, so as not to minimize the number of unsold lots. So in terms of sort of younger artists, you had a beautiful Daniel McKinney work, which came to auction, which sold for approximately £250,000. And in terms of sort of the more, high figure sale, we had a Modigliani portrait, which sold for 6.2 million, and a Francis Bacon work painting, which went for 6.6. So those were quite strong, and a really beautiful Egon Schiele work on paper, which actually surpassed its estimate by quite a bit and went all the way to over £3 million. So there were some great artworks that performed well. I think star works tend to be immune to sort of really bearish markets, but at the same time, you could sort of feel that overall, compared to sort of when the market was doing incredibly well and at a very high point, this was still a sort of conservative sale compared to some previous ones from preceding years. Another thing that's just worth mentioning when it comes to London auction market in general is sort of with the change in government and post-Brexit, the market in London has generally contracted. There's been a bit of a wealth drain from the capital. And so people have found that fewer people are willing to consign works during this kind of current environment, and fewer buyers are present. So that has had an overall effect on the local environment and the local market. When it came to the Surrealist sale, there was a beautiful Rene Magritte work which sold for about £10 million. And that was sort of the star lot of the Surrealist sale. And that obviously came off the back of the New York auctions, which we discussed in our last video. Rene Magritte was sort of the hero of the auction season. And the 100-year anniversary of Surrealism took place last year. And so I think Surrealism still feels very relevant and hot to the market at the moment. There were also a series of 3 quite surprising paintings by a Belgian surrealist artist called Paul Delvaux, and they came to market as well, and they actually exceeded expectations and did very, very well. So those are sort of the key takeaways from Christie's. When it came to Sotheby's, you had the former Blink-182 band leader, Marcus Hopper, who consigned his Banksy work, which sold for sort of £4.3 million. So that was sort of one of the kind of key lots of the season.
Banksy and Magritte had quite a good auction.
Yes, they did. I would
Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. I would definitely say so. And then also there was a fantastic Nara portrait, which did very well at Sotheby's, and he's due to have an exhibition at the Hayward Gallery later this year. So that's sort of tied in nicely with the institutional calendar for London. It's going to be at the Hayward Gallery. And then there was also an incredible Lisa Bryce portrait, After Ember, which went way above its estimate. And that was an example of a more emerging, well, sort of younger artist actually doing incredibly well. But it was also incredibly striking example of her work, which I think was met with a lot of demand.
Okay, so that's half in the news.
Yeah.
So TAFE stands for the European Fine Art Foundation. Their fair in Maastricht, they purport to represent 7,000 years of art. This year was very interesting. I had a number of friends who dealers that in galleries that I buy from. They were showing at TAFE this year. What was particularly interesting is that they feel that Fenner has made quite a concerted effort to appeal to a new generation of collectors. So this year saw the inclusion of more modern and contemporary pieces. At Taffeta Galleries, they were focusing on African modernism. They were showing 6 artists who were also shown last year at the 2024 Venice Biennale. Ben and Wanru, Twin 77, Suzanne Wenger, and a number of other modernists. And they were shown alongside contemporary African artists, Yinka Shonobare as well. And they were showing a wonderful artist called Baba Jide Olatunji, who does very hyper-realistic images. They're quite special. So that was quite an unusual sort of display to see at K-pop this year, and it apparently did very well. It was a fabulous fair this year by all accounts. I will absolutely have to get there next year.
Definitely. Yeah. I think that sounds really refreshing that they're finally starting to show art from a broad spectrum of regions. And I think that the fact that they're adapting to the market and this new generation of buyers that's kind of coming in, that sounds like a very smart thing to do, but also it sounds like a refreshing thing to do, given that it's a fair that has been around for such a long time and has kind of mainly been centered on antiquities and sort of old masters until more recently.
I mean, across the board, it sort of seems to be a real story of evolution and innovation in the art market.
Definitely. Yes. And on that note, there's a really interesting story which has yet to be confirmed, so highly speculative at the moment, but interesting nonetheless. Pace and Sotheby's auction are in talks to potentially start a partnership together. What that will
Very big news.
Enormous news.
Yeah.
I was, extremely sort of excited and full of questions at the same time when I first initially read the sort of leak hit the press. So, what that looks like is unclear, whether that's a merger, whether it's a cash injection, whether it's a sort of an acquisition, outright acquisition. It's not clear at this time, but just to give some sort of context to the story, both Pace and Sotheby's have obviously, Sotheby's we've covered previously, but Sotheby's has quite openly been going through a bit of a challenging year, especially in 2024. And their sort of credit rating on the stock market had been downgraded. They they were in a position where they needed some sort of cash injection into the business. And so actually the UAE Wealth Sovereign Fund gave them a $1 billion check last year, of which $800 million were earmarked for debt relief. They also had a number of layoffs in a lot of their major headquarters. So things weren't looking that great. They also had a whole pricing structure, a new fee structure they had introduced about 7 months ago, which they then reversed and U-turned on earlier this year because it was very unpopular and they were probably losing business as a result. So it's been a bit of a choppy sort of year for them. Pace, on the other hand, had invested a lot in their New York headquarters. So it seems like both of them are financially in slightly choppy waters. And so the idea of joining forces could actually be beneficial to both. The ways in which that could be helpful would be, for example, with Pace and Sotheby's. Sotheby's would get access to a whole bevy of new clients, so via Pace that they may not already be interacting with. Not only that, but Pace also would be working directly with artists and would have great access to works, and also estates, and they would have an understanding of when estates might be sort of available to secure on the market. And so that could help create a really great channel of supply to Sotheby's, their auction sales. Sotheby's also have something called SFS, which is Sotheby's Financial Services. So Sotheby's Financial Services is a service that Sotheby's provides whereby they provide loans to clients. And they gain their income based on the interest. They charge sort of higher interest on the loans. And what they do is they would use the artwork as collateral and ensure that the work is sold with Sotheby's if the client couldn't come good on their loan. So it could be an interesting financial service for Pace to also offer their clients, especially in a market where people are buying less. So being able to kind of have loans could kind of free up people's spending. So it could be basically mutually beneficial to both businesses. Pace would also then have access to Sotheby's client database, which I'm sure would be very interesting to them. And not to mention that both the gallery and both Sotheby's have offices internationally and spaces internationally in which to exhibit art. So this potential collaboration could be a very interesting one. The words that have been mentioned so far have been, it would be a new model. So what the ins and outs of that looks like, no one really knows until it will be announced.
Would it alienate other galleries, or would it possibly be inclusive in some way? Or
I'm not sure, but all I know for certain is that this is not the first time this has happened. Christie's actually purchased Horncher Venetian.
They did,
yeah, back in 2006, I believe. And eventually that sort of slotted into their private sales department, and it became part of Christie's as we know it now. But Sotheby's had also bought Nordman Gallery back in 2007, so both within sort of a year of each other. And
okay, so there's precedent for this.
There is a precedent for this, exactly. So how it plays out in today's market and in today's environment, no one knows, because like we said, we're seeing sort of innovations that we've never seen before, which is where galleries are now sharing spaces. They're either running exhibitions concurrently or they're sort of giving each other the space to take turns. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. But these are two major brands in the art world, each with different footing. One is an auction house, the other is a mega gallery. And it'll be very interesting to see the marrying of those two companies and any future projects that come from that relationship and that collaboration. So watch this space.
Always so interesting chatting to you, Nadia. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Aita. It's been such a pleasure as always.